John, pardon, Edward Gibbon Wakefield, a letter from Sydney, the principal town of Australasia, is at once a travel narrative, a social satire, a work of political economy, and a foundation treatise in colonial theory. Written in the form of a reflective letter, the text uses the author's supposed personal experiences in New South Wales to advance a systematic critique of British colonial policy. Beneath its anecdotal tone lies a rigorous argument that the fundamental problem of colonial society is not poverty of resources but the excess of land. Wakefield contends that the abundance of fertile territory freely accessible to settlers destroys the very economic and social relations necessary for sustained development. His work is therefore not simply descriptive but prescriptive, proposing a structural solution to what he sees as the fatal flaw of unregulated colonization. Wakefield begins by dismantling the romantic image of colonial prosperity. He describes the physical environment of Australasia as blessed with a healthy climate, abundant timber, mineral wealth, and thriving livestock. Nature, he concedes, has fully performed her part in bestowing comforts and luxuries. Yet, this natural abundance doesn't translate into economic prosperity. The central paradox of the colony lies in the fact that vast estates, rich in coal, iron, and timber, possesses no exchangeable value. Land can be obtained for almost nothing. Because it is plentiful, it cannot command a price. The author's own acquisition of 20,000 acres for a trivial sum becomes a cautionary example. What appears magnificent in England is worthless in New South Wales. Value, he suggests, is not inherent in physical possession but arises from scarcity, labor, and market demand. Where land is limitless, it ceases to function as capital. From this starting point, Wakefield develops a critique of colonial settlement patterns. In Britain, social hierarchy and economic interdependence arise from limited access to productive land. Laborers must sell their labor because they cannot easily acquire property. In Australasia, by contrast, a laborer who accumulates modest savings can obtain land and become an independent producer. This transformation undermines the wage-labor relationship. Employers cannot retain workers because workers quickly become competitors. The scarcity of labor, not the, not the scarcity of land, defines the colonial economy. Immigration, he argues, doesn't solve this problem. Even if thousands of new immigrants arrive, they will too acquire land and exit the labor market. The structural imbalance remains unchanged so long as unappropriated territory is freely available. Wakefield's reflection on immigration policy reveal the depth of his economic reasoning. He recounts various schemes to import indentured laborers, only to demonstrate their inevitable failure. Bonds, contractual obligations, and delayed land grants cannot permanently restrain the settlers' aspiration to independence. The moment laborers perceive the opportunity to become proprietors, they abandon wage employment. This dynamic, in his view, explains why colonies remain underdeveloped despite continuous population growth. The issue is not insufficient people, but the disproportion between population and accessible land. So long as territory remains immense in proportion to numbers, labor will be scarce and wages high, preventing the accumulation of capital and the formation of complex industries. At the heart of Wakefield's argument lies his famous question whether it is possible to establish in a new country such a proportion between people and land as would render labor plentiful and not extravagantly dear. This question gives rise to his theory of systematic colonization. Instead of granting land freely, colonial authorities should sell it at a sufficient price, high enough to prevent immediate acquisition by laborers, yet not so high as to deter settlement altogether. The revenue generated from these sales would fund further immigration, ensuring a steady supply of wage labor. By artificially restricting the access of land, the colony could reproduce the economic structure of Britain with stable class of workers and capitalists. In essence, Wakefield seeks to manufacture scarcity in order to sustain capitalist relations. This proposal is not merely economic but deeply political and social. Wakefield associates the absence of labor discipline with moral and cultural degradation. He portrays the bush as a place of physical deprivation and psychological isolation. Settlers lack intellectual society, refined manners, and cultivated tastes. Conversation revolves around wool prices rather than philosophy or science. Social hierarchies are unstable and often absurd, yet fiercely dependent. The colony in his depiction oscillates between vulgar imitation of English aristocracy and crude egalitari- egalitarianism born of material abundance, without a structured class system anchored in property relations. Social society remains fragmented and immature. Wakefield's reflections on slavery further illuminate his reasoning. Though he professes moral revulsion at the institution, he acknowledges its economic efficacy. In other colonial contexts, slavery, he argues, has historically mitigated the labor-land imbalance in new settlements by coercively supplying workers. While he does not advocate its introduction in Australasia without qualification, his discussion reveals a stark utilitarian logic. Wealth and civilization, he suggests, have often depended on forced labor where voluntary labor was inefficient. His ultimate goal, however, is to avert slavery by creating economic conditions that make free labor abundant without controlled land distribution. The political implications of Wakefield's analysis are equally significant. He observes the government in new countries exercise extraordinary power to control of land grants by expanding or restricting access to territory. They can influence wages, property values, social mobility. Land policy becomes central instrument of governance. The governor, though geographically distant from Britain's political center, wields economic authority that shapes the entire colony. In highlighting this dynamic, Wakefield reveals an acute awareness of how economic structures underpin political power. When situated within the broader tradition of classical political economy, Wakefield's idea both extend and challenge his predecessors. Adam Smith celebrated the benefits of free market and labor mobility, yet Wakefield contends that unregulated freedom in colonies and undermines economic development. David Ricardo analyzed rent as arising from differences in land fertility under conditions of scarcity. Wakefield demonstrates that where land is universally abundant, rent disappears and capital stagnates. His theory thus adapts classical principles to colonial conditions, emphasizing the necessity of artificial constraints to sustain market relations. Moreover, Wakefield's work anticipates later debates about settler colonialism and imperial expansion. By framing colonization as a solution to Britain's redundant population, he aligns immigration with domestic social policy. Colonies become outlets for surplus labor, yet only if structured correctly. The Greek colonies, he notes, contain a mixture of classes and preserve regularity and subordination. He aspires to replicate that balance in Australasia. The colony must not be a dumping ground for convicts and adventurers, but carefully organized extension of British society. At the tone of a letter from Sydney oscillates between satire and seriousness. Wakefield mocks his own naivety and the pretensions of colonial elites, yet beneath the irony lies a coherent blueprint for reform. His personal disappointments, failed agricultural ventures, unreliable servants, inflated building costs serve as empirical evidence for theoretical conclusions. The narrative voice, though fictionalized, reinforces the authenticity of his critic. Experience, rather than the abstract speculation, grounds his political economy. In conclusion, Wakefield's A Letter from Sydney stands as a foundational text in the history of colonial thought. It identifies labor-land imbalance as the defining challenge of settler societies and proposes a systematic remedy rooted in controlled land pricing. By linking economic structure to social order, political authority, and moral development, Wakefield transforms a colonial travel narrative into a sophisticated treatise on political economy. His insights shaped settlement policies in South Asia, New Zealand, and beyond, leaving a lasting imprint on imperial governance. More broadly, his work reveals how the creation of market and maintenance of class depend not solely on natural abundance but on deliberate institutional design. In confronting the paradox of abundance, Wakefield redefined the principle of colonization for the modern capitalist age.